Mother's Day 2025 in St. Louis started like it should have, with love, with family, with hope. The young mother woke up that Sunday morning, got her 3-year-old son ready, and headed to church. It was supposed to be her day, a day to celebrate motherhood, to honor the woman who brought life into this world. But this Mother's Day carried an extra weight of meaning. You see, May 11th wasn't just Mother's Day, it was also her late mother's birthday. The woman who had passed away just 4 years earlier, leaving behind 8 children. The eldest daughter had stepped up, becoming not just a sister, but a second mother to 7 younger siblings. She was carrying on a legacy, honoring a memory, trying to fill an impossible void. So when she sat in that church pew that morning, holding her little boy's hand, maybe she was thinking about her own mother. Maybe she was praying for strength to keep being the rock her family needed. Maybe she was looking forward to the summer trip to Chicago they were planning for her upcoming 25th birthday, just a few weeks away. But we know something she didn't know that morning. We know that by 7:33 that evening, everything would change. That this day meant for celebrating mothers would become the day she'd never see another Mother's Day. That her 3-year-old son and her younger siblings would witness something no child should ever see. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't some stranger lurking in the shadows. This was someone she knew intimately. Someone who shared the most precious thing in her life, their child. Someone who was supposed to protect her, not destroy her. What we're about to uncover together isn't just another case file gathering dust on a detective's desk. This is the story of how a custody dispute, something that happens in family courts across America every single day, escalated into an act so violent, so public, so devastating, that it would shatter not just one life, but an entire family's future. But here's what haunts us. What could possibly drive someone to commit such an act in front of innocent children? What level of rage, what kind of desperation, what complete breakdown of humanity leads a person to turn a family gathering into a crime scene? And how do you explain to a 3-year-old why daddy hurt mommy and she's never coming home? We want to know what you think. What pushes someone over that edge? What warning signs might we all be missing in our own communities, in our own families? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready to explore these dark corners of human nature with us, hit that like button and subscribe to Crime Vault Stories, because the answers we find together might just help us understand how to prevent the next tragedy. But first, we need to understand who this young mother really was, and why her loss created a void that 8 children will feel for the rest of their lives. Her name was Jory Hadley, and at just 24 years old, she was carrying a burden that most people twice her age would struggle with. When we think about what it means to be the eldest child, we might think about extra chores, babysitting duties, maybe being the example for younger siblings. But for Jory, being the eldest of 8 children meant something entirely different after January 2021. That's when their mother died suddenly of a heart attack. Just like that, 8 children lost their anchor, their guide, their everything. And while the younger ones were still processing the devastating loss of their mom, Jory made a decision that would define the rest of her short life. She moved back home. She stepped into a role that no 20-year-old should ever have to fill. Think about what that really means. 7 younger siblings looking to you, not just for big sister advice, but for everything their mother used to provide. Who's going to pack the school lunches? Who's going to help with homework? Who's going to be there when they have nightmares, when they're sick, when they need someone to sign permission slips or attend parent-teacher conferences? But here's what makes Jory's story even more complex. She wasn't just trying to be a mother figure to 7 kids. She was also a mother to her own 3-year-old son. So we're talking about a young woman who went from being responsible for 1 child to essentially raising 8 children, all while dealing with her own grief over losing her mother. And yet, from everything we know about Jory, she embraced this responsibility with love. Her family wasn't just surviving, they were planning for the future. That summer trip to Chicago for her 25th birthday wasn't just a vacation. It was a celebration. It was proof that despite everything they'd been through, despite losing their mother, despite the overwhelming responsibility Jory had taken on, they were still a family. They were still finding reasons to celebrate, to hope, to dream. Can we take a moment to appreciate what that really represents? Here's a young woman who could have easily said, "I have my own child to worry about. I can't handle 7 more." She could have left her siblings to figure it out with other relatives or the system. Instead, she chose love. She chose sacrifice. She chose to put her family first, even when it meant putting her own dreams and ambitions on hold. The people who knew Jory describe her as someone who never complained about this massive responsibility. She didn't see it as a burden. She saw it as love in action. She was honoring her mother's memory by making sure those 8 children stayed together, stayed loved, stayed safe. But we also need to understand that this level of responsibility comes with stress. Managing 8 children's needs, emotions, schedules, problems, that's exhausting. Add to that the normal challenges of co-parenting a 3-year-old with someone you're no longer in a relationship with, and you start to see the pressure Jory was under every single day. She was navigating custody arrangements, trying to maintain some kind of relationship with her son's father for the sake of their child, all while being the primary caregiver for 7 other kids who were still processing their own trauma and loss. What's heartbreaking is that was doing it all with such grace that her family was genuinely excited about the future. They weren't just surviving day to day, they were planning that Chicago trip. They were looking forward to celebrating her 25th birthday together. They had found their new normal, and it was working because Jory had made it work through sheer determination and love. So when Mother's Day 2025 rolled around, a day that held extra significance because it was also their late mother's birthday, it should have been a day of reflection, of gratitude, of honoring both the mother they'd lost and the woman who had stepped up to fill that impossible void. Instead, it became the day that 8 children would lose their second mother in less than 5 years. The question that haunts us is this: how does someone look at a young woman who has sacrificed so much for her family and decide that she deserves to die? How does a custody dispute escalate to the point where taking the mother away from 8 children seems like an acceptable solution? Every tragedy has a moment where everything could have gone differently. A single decision, a different choice, a step back, instead of forward. For Jory Hadley, that moment was building throughout the spring of 2025, and it all centered around one relationship that should have been about love but had become about control. DeAndre Miller was 28 years old and the father of Jory's 3-year-old son. Like many former couples who share a child, Jory and DeAndre had to navigate the complicated world of co-parenting. But what should have been straightforward conversations about pickup times, weekends, and holidays had become something much more contentious. Custody disputes are unfortunately common. Courts across America handle thousands of them every year. Most of the time, even when emotions run high, even when there's anger and resentment, parents find a way to work it out for the sake of their children. They might not like each other anymore, but they understand that their child needs both parents in their life. But some disputes carry an undercurrent of something darker. When one parent sees custody not as shared responsibility, but as ownership. When access to a child becomes a weapon rather than a privilege. When the conversation shifts from "what's best for our child" to "what you owe me." We don't know all the details of what Jory and DeAndre were fighting about in the weeks leading up to Mother's Day. What we do know is that by May 11th, 2025, their disagreements had reached a boiling point. And unfortunately for Jory, she had no way of knowing just how dangerous that boiling point had become. Mother's Day evening found Jory exactly where she spent most of her time, with her family. After that morning church service with her son, she was in the Ville neighborhood of St. Louis, specifically in the 4200 to 4400 block of Maffitt Avenue. This wasn't some isolated location. This was a community area where families lived, where children played, where neighbors knew each other. Jory was in a vehicle with her 3-year-old son and several of her younger siblings. Remember, this is a woman who rarely went anywhere without some of her family members. They were her responsibility, her priority, her constant companions. So when DeAndre Miller approached them that evening to continue their ongoing custody dispute, Jory's little boy and her siblings were right there to witness it. What started that confrontation? Was it a planned meeting? Or did Miller just happen to see them? Did Jory know he was coming? Or was she ambushed by his presence? These are questions that matter because they tell us about intention, about premeditation, about whether this was a moment of heated emotion or something more calculated. The initial argument happened, and here's where we see one of those moments that could have changed everything. After the confrontation with Miller, Jory and her family left. They went to an auto parts store. They had a chance to decompress, to cool down, to maybe even decide to call it a night and head home where they'd be safe. But they came back. They returned to that same area on Maffitt Avenue where the argument had taken place. Why did they come back? Was there unfinished business? Did Miller ask them to return? Were they meeting someone else and Miller showed up again? Or did Jory think the situation had cooled down enough that it was safe to return? This decision to come back would haunt her family forever. Because when they returned to Maffitt Avenue, Miller was there too. And whatever had been simmering during their brief separation was about to explode into something irreversible. The second confrontation was different from the first. There was something in the air that made this feel more dangerous, more volatile. Maybe it was the way Miller was acting. Maybe it was something he said. Maybe Jory sensed that this wasn't just another argument about custody arrangements. But here's what we need to understand about domestic disputes. They can escalate faster than anyone expects. 1 minute, you're having a heated conversation about who gets the child on weekends, and the next minute, threats are being made. 1 minute, it's angry words, and the next minute, someone is reaching for something that will make those threats real. The witnesses to this second confrontation, Jory's siblings who were in that vehicle, would later describe a scene that went from tension to terror in a matter of minutes. This wasn't a long, drawn-out fight. This wasn't hours of escalating violence. This was a situation that went from argument to deadly force so quickly that no one had time to intervene, to call for help, to get away. And that raises a question that we need to consider together. How do we recognize when a family dispute has crossed the line from heated argument to genuine danger? How do we know when someone we once trusted, someone who shares our children, someone who was once part of our life, has become someone capable of ultimate violence? Think about your own experiences with conflict, with arguments, with people who have disappointed or angered you. At what point do we cross from "I'm really upset with this person" to "I want to hurt this person"? And more importantly, what are the warning signs that someone in our life has crossed that line? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like an argument was escalating beyond normal anger? What did you do? How did you recognize the danger? Because understanding these warning signs might be the key to preventing the next tragedy. But right now, we need to understand what happened in those final moments on Maffitt Avenue, when words became actions and a family dispute became a crime scene. There are moments in criminal cases that define everything that comes after. Moments where the evidence is so clear, so devastating, that there's no ambiguity about what happened. 7:33 p.m. on May 11th, 2025 was one of those moments. DeAndre Miller had been arguing with Jory about their son, about custody, about whatever grievances had been building between them. The conversation was happening right there in front of the children. Jory's 3-year-old son was in that vehicle, along with her younger siblings who depended on her for everything. Then Miller did something that, for just a moment, might have given everyone hope that this was over. He walked away. He turned his back on the vehicle, where Jory sat in the front passenger seat, and he walked away like he was done with the argument, like he was going to let it go. Jory's siblings in that car probably felt relief. The tension was broken. The shouting was over. Maybe now they could finally go home and salvage what was left of Mother's Day. Maybe the worst thing that would happen was that dinner would be cold and everyone would be emotionally drained from the drama. Her 3-year-old son, sitting in that vehicle, probably didn't understand most of what had been happening between his parents. At 3 years old, raised voices might be scary, but Daddy walking away might have seemed like the end of whatever was making everyone upset. But Miller wasn't done. Whatever was driving him that evening, whatever rage or desperation or calculation was motivating his actions, walking away wasn't going to satisfy it. He turned around. He came back to that vehicle where Jory was sitting with their child and her siblings. What happened next occurred so fast that the children in that car barely had time to understand what they were seeing. Miller approached the vehicle where Jory was sitting in the front passenger seat. He had a firearm with him. Where he got it, whether he'd been carrying it the whole time, whether he went to get it when he walked away, these are details that investigators would later piece together. But in that moment, what mattered was that a man who had just walked away from an argument was now back, and he was armed. Jory was trapped. She was in the passenger seat of a vehicle surrounded by children who were depending on her to keep them safe. There was nowhere to run, no time to escape, no way to shield everyone who needed protecting. Miller pointed that firearm directly at Jory and fired. Not once, multiple times. Multiple gunshots rang out in the 4400 block of Maffitt Avenue, while children watched in absolute terror. The sound of gunshots in a residential neighborhood brings a specific kind of panic. Neighbors stop what they're doing. People grab their phones. Someone immediately calls 911 because everyone knows that sound means someone is in mortal danger. But inside that vehicle, the sound of those gunshots meant something far more personal and devastating. Jory's siblings watched their sister, the woman who had raised them after their mother died, the woman who had sacrificed her own youth to keep their family together, get shot multiple times by the father of her child. Her 3-year-old son watched his father shoot his mother. Let that sink in for a moment. A 3-year-old child, who should be worried about toys and cartoons and whether he'll get a bedtime story, instead witnessed his father commit the ultimate act of violence against his mother. The psychological trauma inflicted on those children in that moment is almost impossible to comprehend. They didn't just lose Jory that evening. They lost their sense of safety, their trust in the adults who were supposed to protect them, their belief that the world was a place where love existed instead of violence. After the shooting, Miller didn't stay to face what he had done. He didn't check on his son, who was now motherless because of his actions. He didn't consider the other children who had just been traumatized beyond measure. He ran. He fled the scene in another vehicle, leaving behind a crime scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. At 7:33 p.m., the emergency call came in. Someone in the neighborhood had heard those gunshots and called for help. When St. Louis police officers arrived at the 4400 block of Maffitt Avenue, they found exactly what you'd expect at the scene of a violent crime: chaos, terror, and tragedy. Jory Hadley was still in that front passenger seat where Miller had shot her. Multiple gunshot wounds had ended the life of a 24-year-old woman who had spent her last 4 years trying to hold her family together. Emergency medical services responded, but there was nothing they could do. Jory was pronounced dead at the scene. The officers who responded that night had to deal with not just a homicide scene, but traumatized children who had witnessed the whole thing. Her siblings, including that 3-year-old boy, were now witnesses to their sister and mother's murder. They had to be interviewed. They had to relive what they had just seen. They had to try to answer questions about the worst moment of their lives. Later, investigators would locate the shooting scene in the 4200 block of Maffitt, confirming exactly where Miller had opened fire. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were clear about what they had seen. There was no mystery about who had pulled the trigger or why Jory Hadley was dead. But knowing who committed the crime and catching him would prove to be two different challenges entirely. Because while Jory's family was processing the immediate trauma of what they had witnessed, DeAndre Miller was already working on making sure he wouldn't have to face the consequences of what he had done. What none of them knew that night was that this was just the beginning of their nightmare, not the end. In most homicide investigations, detectives spend weeks or even months trying to identify a suspect. They follow leads that go nowhere, interview witnesses who saw nothing useful, and piece together evidence that might point to someone, anyone, who had motive and opportunity to commit murder. But the murder of Jory Hadley wasn't most cases. When you commit a violent crime in front of multiple witnesses who know exactly who you are, when you flee a scene where children can identify you by name, when the motive is documented in ongoing custody disputes, you don't get the luxury of anonymity that most killers rely on. Jory's siblings didn't just witness a random shooting. They watched someone they knew, someone who had been part of their extended family through his relationship with their sister, commit an act of violence that would change their lives forever. When detectives interviewed these traumatized children, they didn't have to ask, "Can you describe the shooter?" They had to ask, "Can you tell us exactly what DeAndre Miller did to your sister?" The identification was immediate and certain. Within days of Mother's Day 2025, St. Louis detectives knew they were looking for 28-year-old DeAndre Miller. They knew his relationship to the victim, they knew his motive, they had witnesses who could place him at the scene. What they didn't know was where he had gone. Miller wasn't stupid. He understood that shooting someone in front of witnesses meant he had very little time before law enforcement would be looking for him. His immediate flight from the scene showed he had no intention of staying around to face what he had done. But running from a murder charge in 2025 isn't like it was decades ago. Technology, communication networks, and investigative techniques have made it nearly impossible to disappear completely. For nearly a month, Miller managed to stay ahead of the investigation. While Jory's family was planning her funeral, while her siblings were trying to process losing their second mother, while her 3-year-old son was probably asking when mommy was coming home, Miller was hiding somewhere in St. Louis, thinking he might actually get away with murder. But investigators were building their case methodically. They were tracking his known associates, monitoring his usual haunts, following every lead that might tell them where a wanted killer was hiding. The pressure was mounting, and eventually, someone was going to slip up. That someone turned out to be Miller himself. By June 3rd, 2025, less than a month after the murder, detectives had enough information to obtain a search warrant for a residence in the 4600 block of Corday Avenue. They had reason to believe Miller was hiding there, and they were ready to bring him in. Search warrants for fugitive apprehension are high-risk operations. You're dealing with someone who has already shown they're willing to use deadly violence, someone who has nothing left to lose, someone who knows that being captured means facing the consequences of what they've done. Law enforcement has to be prepared for anything. When officers approached that residence on Corday Avenue, Miller proved exactly how dangerous he still was. The moment he saw police, he didn't surrender. He didn't accept that his time as a fugitive was over. Instead, he tried to run. Again, this wasn't the panicked flight of someone who committed a crime of passion and immediately regretted it. This was the calculated escape attempt of someone who had been planning for this moment. Someone who was prepared to do whatever it took to avoid arrest. But Miller wasn't just running from patrol officers. St. Louis police had brought backup in the form of a K-9 unit. The dog's name was Admiral, and Admiral was trained to apprehend fleeing suspects. When Miller tried to escape, Admiral was released to stop him. What happened next tells us everything we need to know about Miller's mindset nearly a month after killing Jory. When Admiral caught up to him, Miller didn't just resist arrest in the normal sense, trying to pull away or struggle against handcuffs. Instead, he attacked the police dog. He put Admiral in a headlock, trying to physically overpower an animal that was just doing its job. Think about what that means. This is a man who had already shown he was willing to kill the mother of his child in front of witnesses. Now he was showing he was willing to attack a police dog to avoid facing the consequences. There was no remorse here, no acceptance of responsibility, no recognition that what he had done was wrong. There was only a desperate, violent determination to escape justice. Officers eventually subdued Miller and took him into custody, but not before he had demonstrated once again that he was someone who would use violence against anyone or anything that stood in his way, whether that was Joy, her family, or even a police dog trying to do its job. Admiral, fortunately, was unharmed, but Miller's attack on the K9 would add another charge to his growing list of alleged crimes. Because attacking a law enforcement animal isn't just resisting arrest. It's a separate felony that shows continued disregard for law and order. Miller was transported to the St. Louis City Justice Center and held without bond. After nearly a month of freedom, while Jory's family grieved, while her children tried to make sense of a world without her, while her 3-year-old son waited for a mother who would never come home, the man who had destroyed their lives was finally behind bars. But being arrested was just the beginning of Miller's legal troubles. The St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office was preparing charges that would reflect not just the murder of Jory Hadley, but every aspect of the harm he had caused that Mother's Day evening. The hunt for Miller was over. Now the fight for justice was about to begin. When we talk about the victims of violent crime, we often focus on the person who lost their life. But the murder of Jory Hadley created a devastation that extends far beyond one tragic death. This was a crime that shattered an entire family structure, traumatized multiple children, and left a 3-year-old boy without his mother. Jory's sister Jania will never forget the phone call that changed everything. She described receiving a frantic, screaming call from one of her younger brothers. The terror in his voice, the chaos in the background, the horrible realization that something unspeakable had happened to their family. When Jania arrived at the scene on Maffitt Avenue, she found a nightmare that no sister should ever have to witness. Police cars, crime scene tape, and in the back of one of those police vehicles, her young nephew and her younger siblings, crying, traumatized, trying to process what they had just seen happen to the person who had been their anchor since their mother's death. Remember, these children had already survived one devastating loss. In January 2021, they lost their mother to a sudden heart attack. Jory had stepped in to fill that impossible void, becoming not just their sister, but their guardian, their protector, their second mother. For 4 years, she had been rebuilding their sense of security and family stability. Now, in a matter of minutes, they had lost her too. 8 children who had already learned that the adults they love can disappear without warning now had to face that reality again. But this time, it wasn't a heart attack. It was deliberate violence committed by someone they knew, someone who had been part of their extended family. On June 4, 2025, the St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office filed comprehensive charges against DeAndre Miller that reflected the full scope of his alleged crimes. Murder in the first degree for taking Jory's life. Armed criminal action for using a firearm during the commission of a felony. Unlawful use of a weapon and unlawful possession of a firearm. But perhaps most significantly, endangering the welfare of a child in the first degree, acknowledging that his actions traumatized innocent children who will carry those memories for the rest of their lives. The charges also included assault on a law enforcement animal and felony resisting arrest for his attack on K9 Admiral during his apprehension. Miller remains in custody without bond, which tells us that the court system recognizes both the severity of his alleged crimes and the danger he poses to the community. As this case moves through the legal system, Jory's family continues to seek what they call justice and peace. But what does justice really look like for 8 children who have now lost 2 mothers? What does peace mean for a 3-year-old who watched his father kill his mother? How do you rebuild a family structure when the person who held it all together is gone? The legal proceedings will eventually run their course. Miller will face trial, and hopefully he'll be held accountable for what he allegedly did on Mother's Day 2025. But the real consequence of his actions, the trauma inflicted on innocent children, the family structure destroyed, the future that Jory will never see, those wounds will take much longer to heal, if they ever do completely. Jory Hadley's story reminds us that domestic violence doesn't just destroy the direct victims. It creates waves of trauma that affect entire families, entire communities. It robs children of their sense of safety and steals futures that should have been filled with love and possibility. If you want to continue exploring cases that examine the true cost of violence in our communities, subscribe to Crime Vault Stories, because understanding these tragedies, really understanding their impact, might be the first step toward preventing them. Some stories end with justice served. Others end with lessons learned. Jory's story ends with a family forever changed, still seeking both.